Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to all of you, depending on which part of the world you are in. I am delighted to welcome all of you today to this webinar on behalf of WRI. This webinar will really have two subcomponents. One is the launch of a report that WRI India has worked on landscape restoration in the Sidhi district of Madhya Pradesh, as well as an announcement of our partnership with the government of Madhya Pradesh in taking forward the implementation of this report. The second part of this webinar will be a very interesting panel discussion on unlocking finance for nature-based solutions. And this will be moderated by my colleague from the Global Office, Sean Devitt. But coming back to why we worked on this, as you're all aware, India has nearly 18% of the world's global population, but only about 2.5% of the world's landmass. Therefore, the optimal use of its available land resources is not just critical to meet our food and nutrition needs, but also to ensure livelihoods for the nearly 700 people who live in rural India. Therefore, it's critical to protect and restore our lands and ensure the flow of ecosystem services very smoothly. My colleague Ruchika Singh will a little later present the findings of our report, and we will have perspectives from several other experts in this field. But apart from almost 170 participants that I see and still counting, we also have a galaxy of experts and very well-renowned figures on this webinar. We will be calling upon them one by one to sort of give their perspectives, and I will introduce them as we call upon them. As a slight deviation from traditional protocol that we see in India, let me first start, or rather kickstart the proceedings today by inviting Mr. Jamshed Godrej to launch the Sidhi landscape restoration report. But before he does that, a brief word of introduction about Mr. Godrej. Mr. Godrej is a very well-known figure in India. He really needs no introduction. But nevertheless, what I would add is he's the chairman of the board of Godrej and Boyce Manufacturing Company Limited. This is a well-renowned company in India. He is recognized as one of the captains of the industry in India. As a small child, I've been aware of Godrej as a name. It's a brand name in India that goes back many, many years. He is not just a member of the WRI Global Board of Directors, but is the chair of WRI India's Board of Directors. He was conferred the Padma Bhushan by the President of India in April 2003. We are indeed proud and privileged to have him as our chairman and mentor. With this, let me invite Mr. Godrej to formally launch the landscape restoration report of the Sidhi district.
Thank you, OP. It's my pleasure to launch the landscape report of the Sidhi district of Madhya Pradesh.
So we have the formal launch happening with this, and a small video that we will play on what this is all about. Thank you for that launch, Mr. Godrej. May I now invite you for your address?
Thank you, OP. And on behalf of WRI, I want to welcome all our guests on this call and all the participants who have joined this call. I think we all know very well that landscape restoration is a crucial activity, and India has a vision of doubling farmer incomes and improving livelihoods. And but this cannot be achieved in isolation. I think we have to have that commitment to safeguard and restore the environment. And I think we all realize that with the outbreak of COVID-19, it's had a very, very significant impact on people's lives and livelihoods, and particularly of migrant workers. And we have to rethink our economic and growth models to the benefit of everyone. And I think this idea of build forward better is something about how we can provide opportunities that are beneficial to both people and the planet. As we enter this new era here, I think the importance of nature-based solutions like landscape restoration cannot be if we cannot show how important it is and how crucial it is, because these are cost-effective solutions for economic development, and at the same time we get the benefit of protecting the environment. And as we all know, India has actively participated in the global restoration movement. During the Bond Challenge commitment, we made a commitment to restore 21 million hectares. And also we recently added 5 million hectares made at the United Nations desertification COP last year. And this is also added to this, we have added our ambitious nationally determined contribution, the NDCs, for the Paris Agreement on climate change to sequester 2.5 to 3 gigatons of CO2 through reduced emissions, through landscape restoration. And of course, this is absolutely the right time to invest in people living throughout India's rural landscapes. And it's clear that we need to help entrepreneurs and young people who are restoring land by improving their business plans, building partnerships, and amplifying their success. Last week, we heard from 15 of these innovators who completed the Land Accelerator South Asia program. And this was a program organized by WRI India. And the energy and the ambition of these entrepreneurs showed in their 6 months of work. And this really is something that inspires all of us. And the restoration movement needs them to unlock the true opportunity of restoration and nature-based solutions more broadly. This report from WRI India is timed so well. And I think that, it is the key findings from this report will provide rich information for planning and doing landscape restoration. And its recommendations on inclusive, participatory, and equitable development provide guidance for similar landscape restoration projects in India and across the globe. It is this message of hope that resource-rich but economically poor landscapes which dot India, Asia, Africa, Latin America, all of these can use nature-based solutions to revive lands, restore ecosystem services, conserve biodiversity, and most importantly, create jobs and a thriving local economy. And clearly, at a time like this, these are all very, very crucial. So on the 9th of November, the Department of Panchayat and Rural Development of the Government of Madhya Pradesh and WRI India signed an MOU to develop a collaborative plan for realizing the true potential of restoring Sidhi district's landscape. Under the MOU, the Department of Panchayat and Rural Development and WRI India aim to leverage the flagship schemes such as the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, the Madhya Pradesh State Rural Livelihood Mission, and other initiatives in the livelihoods, infrastructure development, tribal welfare, and panchayat sectors. This work will support the Government of India's need for meeting its international commitments, including its NDCs in the Paris Climate Agreement, the Bond Challenge commitments, and the land degradation neutrality targets to restore 26 million hectares of land, and also will be a big development towards attaining our sustainable development goals. So I'm very pleased to be a part of this launch, and I appreciate our partnership with the government of Madhya Pradesh, and I look forward to hearing more about the project and the discussion that we will have on restoring landscapes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Godrej, for your inspiring words. It's always been of great encouragement to us. And recognizing the importance of landscape restoration and nature-based solutions, I'm glad you recognize the timeliness of this work. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your comments and your keynote address. As Mr. Godrej mentioned, we have entered into a partnership with the government of Madhya Pradesh for collaborative working in restoring lands in the Sidhi district. We have with us today Mr. Manoj Srivastav. Mr. Srivastav is an officer of the Indian Administrative Service. He has been in this from 1987 and currently holds the very important charge, I would say, of being not just the additional chief secretary of the state, but also the development commissioner in the state. I understand that he was also the district collector of Sidhi several years ago. I would like to invite Mr. Srivastav for giving us his perspectives and also say how delighted we are to be able to partnering with the government of MP and with him personally on our taking this work forward. Mr. Srivastav. I think you're on mute. No, not yet. No, I think it's still on. No. I see you on mute still. Now. No. Or is your mic function? Yes.
Am I audible?
Yes. Now you are. Thank you very much. Now you are.
So on behalf of Government of Madhya Pradesh, I welcome you all
I have never been to Sidhi, sir. I was collected Jhabua, not Sidhi.
Oh, sorry,
But Sidhi
sorry,
is
I
one
got
of
it.
those districts. But Sidhi is one of those districts sir, that are classified in a very high vulnerability category with respect to climate change. Madhya Pradesh government got vulnerability and risk assessment exercise carried out under the Climate Change Adaptation in Rural Areas of India project. And it grouped the districts into low, moderate, high, and very high. Sidhi was marked as red, very high. It had very low values of composite vulnerability index, low adaptive capacity, and higher sensitivity to climate change. So it is in the fitness of things that we are going to have this intervention of landscape restoration in this district. Ecological integrity of the district needs to be rebuilt, and as we develop the vulnerability index more holistically by including socio-economic indices, our landscape restoration exercise is also supposed to address the same. The relationship of landscape and livelihood, we believe, is reciprocal. If we heal the landscape, it heals us. The work of restoration cannot begin until the problem is fully and squarely faced. So before doing anything, an honest confession is required. Confession that the ecological functionalities of the district have been severely compromised, lowered, and toyed with. This project is our way of refusing to give up. Repentance may be one ingredient of restoration, but that alone will not do. A fundamental challenge for landscape restoration is the identification of restoration areas within the landscape where multiple functions operating on different scales can be enhanced. We intend to identify different trade-offs and synergies. We also need to generate restoration and regeneration feasibility maps using predictive models, and also intend to map multifunctional hotspots using spatial multi-criteria analysis. In Sidhi, as far as I know, restoration at a landscape scale will be constrained by the diversity of landowners. Additional limitations will also apply in this district where tenurial rights are found sometimes ambiguous. Governance issues also abound. Where deforestation is complete or where humans have occupied the landscape for long periods, there are no records of the original forest or of the wildlife that once occupied them. In so many areas, deforestation or farmland drainage has altered hydrological regimes on local microclimates. Some of the original plants and animals are now extinct, while populations of others have grown and become overabundant. Exotics have colonized the areas and became naturalized and impossible to eradicate. So we have to ensure a realistic assessment of available choices and achievable outcomes. Restoration efforts may not suffice if they are based only on regeneration and plantation. Forest breeding, bird habitat, and black bear habitat connectivity are also equally important. There was a time when the forests of Sidhi district were divided into several shooting blocks. Respective DFOs used to issue shooting permits. There were 4 game sanctuaries in the history of Sidhi, administrative history of Sidhi. They have had their impact on the availability of fauna. Sidhi harbors some very ancient populations whose interrelationships with these diverse fauna resources are very intimate. The tribal community treasures knowledge on various animal species used in 35 different medicinal purposes. These animals are of high consensus value for the community. We have also got an inventory of degraded lands of Sidhi district using remote sensing techniques. Water erosion we found is the man degradation type covering 22% of the total area. Then there are rocky waste, mining of minerals, stony waste, etc. This degradation mostly results from their unsustainable use, causing problems such as soil degradation, erosion, and soil fertility loss, which aggravate existing challenges of poverty. Merging biodiversity conservation efforts with sustainable and resilient livelihoods development in a changing climate is a gold standard of any project, for that matter. Any neglect of social justice issues, any disregarding of the disadvantaged people may damage our eco-centric initiative. As Additional Chief Secretary, Panchayat and Rural Development, I have particularly emphasized on the natural resource management, making use of Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. We have gone for a heavy drive of creating NRM assets. More than 76% works done under the scheme are NRM works. NRM assets have helped small and marginal farmers to improve livelihood opportunities. Access to water for livestock has also increased. SRLM, you have already mentioned. Apart from SRLM and Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, I have seen possibilities of convergence in watershed development scheme also, and for that matter, Pradhan Mantri Krishi Sinchai Yojana also that we administer. I'm glad that the report that is being launched today has been prepared with multi-sectoral engagement and with great deal of transparency. It is trust building and human rights based, resilience seeking report. I congratulate the team that got involved in preparing the report. It's a good augury. Hope it helps give us a focus and frames the dialogue for moving forward. All the very best.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Srivastav. It was a pleasure to hear your perspectives. More importantly, I think it was a pleasure to hear you saying that we refuse to give up. I think that is the spirit that will carry this work forward. Thank you very much for that. Now, on the panel here today, we have Dr. Musonda Mumba, and I would request her to give her perspectives from a global experience that she has. We couldn't get a better person to speak on this topic. Dr. Mumba is the chief of the Terrestrial Ecosystems Unit of the UN Environment and also the chair of the Global Partnership on Forest and Landscape Restoration. She is UNEP's lead on terrestrial ecosystems for the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration that is beginning next year. And as I said, we couldn't have got a better person than her. Her professional experience led her to work with several governments across the world, cutting across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Musonda, may I now invite you to give us your perspectives.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Agwal. Greetings from Nairobi in Kenya. I'm very honored and really humbled to be a part of this launch. And unfortunately, I've never been to India and I desperately would love to visit. I did a lot of work on the Hindu Kush, but I've never visited and I'd love to see.
You have to come. Make sure you come now.
Indeed. As you've mentioned, I would like to give a little bit of a global perspective, particularly from the role of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. Why this decade? I really want to welcome all the participants that are listening in, that on the 1st of March, 2019, the United Nations General Assembly launched through a resolution by many governments, of which the government of India was one of them, a resolution on the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. Why this restoration? Perhaps the best answer really is the circumstances that humanity find themselves in 2020, right in the middle of the COVID pandemic. We have found ourselves in lockdown, we've lost loved ones, and our circumstances really are indicative of our relationship with nature. Something is broken. And so what we're beginning to see is this movement from the ground up. How do we restore these very ecosystems that provide us with the services to keep us healthy and also to keep this planet thriving? So this decade really is a momentous occasion, and it's going to be launched in 2021, really the beginning of the last decade of the Sustainable Development Goals. Because quite frankly, our very existence is dependent on the natural world, life below water and life above land, and very much interconnected with our social circumstances. And I was very glad to see that video from India, because when we talk about forests or we talk about landscapes and ecosystems, we're not talking about them from an economic perspective, nor are we just talking about them from a really environmental perspective. We also talk about the social, the cultural. Why are they so precious for our cultures and the defining of who we are as peoples? So this particular decade really is exploring opportunities and working with communities. And it's really following the model of new power. The idea that young people can start a campaign and initiative on restoration with the right science and right knowledge to be able to restore the very ecosystems that are degraded. Similarly, as we saw from that video, men and women, looking at the intersectionality of these landscapes, agriculture and forest management, wetland ecosystems, mountain ecosystems, how does that all come together? Businesses, as Mr. Gojit talked about as well. So this particular decade really, as the Secretary General did say in his speech on the 3rd of December on the State of the Planet speech, he did say the planet is broken, something is wrong. The fact that the entire planet is in lockdown, something is not right. So how do we rebuild this relationship with the planet? It's really around how we undertake nature-based solutions. And some of these nature-based solutions also are connected to solutions such as forest landscape restoration, and which I'm very, very much in alignment and sort of listening to the different speakers here and also to Mr. Manoj in terms of from the government perspective, how we see engagement of state and non-state actors. And lastly, but not the least, the bigger question that a lot of people are asking, what can we do? And what should we do about the decade? This is your decade. It's everybody's decade, whether you're a state or non-state actor, whether you're young or old. And if you use a phone, I'll send a link in the chat function to share the website. We do have the website for the decade, and we also have a hashtag, and the hashtag is Generation Restoration. And what we've done is to very cleverly have a feature in the algorithm. Whoever uses this hashtag, wherever there will be in the world, it pops up on our website. So we want to see this movement, this momentum, to really begin to see how we reconnect and we rethink our relationship with nature going forward, because we don't have much time. In this next decade, really what we do and how we do it for this planet is so, so important. And lastly, but not the least, you're welcome to even use the visual identity, and that the information is on the website and you can access that visual identity. You can have it on a panel, you can have it in very national, regional, context-specific pamphlets in local languages to really share the story of restoration, because the story of restoration comes from people, from the very individuals who are living in these spaces and thriving and also dealing with their own natural environment, and they understand it. So I'm really, really honored to have been part of this discussion, and I wish you a fantastic deliberation in the course of this webinar. I'm very much looking forward to the final video and listening in on some of the finance and really unlocking finance going forward for landscape restoration. Thank you so very much.
Thanks so much, Musanda. I can't tell you how mesmerizing it was to hear you, how powerfully you convey your feelings. And under your leadership, we really hope the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration will fix the planet, fix the kind of things that we've been doing wrong, and get us all on the right track. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for your words. I really hope to see you and welcome you in India sometime on behalf of WRI India. Thanks so much. Let me now call upon my colleague, Dr. Ruchika Singh, who leads our Sustainable Landscape Restoration Program at WRI India. She holds a double master's degree in politics from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and also a master's in development studies from the International Institute of Social Sciences at The Hague. She was an alumnus of in fact, is an alumnus of the Xavier's Institute of Social Service. Ruchika, as I said, leads our Sustainable Landscape and Restoration Program at WRI India. Over to you, Ruchika.
Thank you, OP. A very warm welcome to everyone on the launch of the report on restoring landscapes in India for climate and communities. This year has been tough for most of us, and one of the things that it has taught us is that nature and people are linked. And as countries plan for economic recovery, it's also important to think about what the impact of climate change would be and how do we mitigate some of those risks. think through in terms of socially inclusive strategies, as well as plan for climate resilience as well. Nature could be an economic winner for COVID-19. There are several economic benefits that can flow from nature-based solutions like protecting and restoring forests, mangroves, etc. Nature-based solutions can help in supporting triple challenge of protecting recovery of nature, meeting the needs of the people, as well as keeping the world within 1.5 degree of global warming. And we know that there can be multiple benefits, both from climate and the development side, that can flow from different nature-based solutions like green jobs and livelihoods, multiple ecosystem services, both in terms of regulatory as well as provisioning services like fuel wood, fodder, food that can flow from nature-based solutions when implemented right. For a country like India, which is 10th most forested country in the world and has 700 million people dependent on forest and agriculture for sustenance, a recovery plan also needs to plan and think about how these connections between nature and people are interlinked. Some of our analysis from Restoration Opportunities Atlas for India indicates that there is immense potential for landscape restoration in India in more than 100 million hectares. On the map that you see, the green areas are areas which are prioritized for protection to reduce fragmentation. The areas in blue are what we call as wide-scale restoration, where forestry is the primary land use, and restoration in these areas could reduce, could help in creating contiguous patches of forest areas. And the mosaic restorations are areas where is a patchwork of land uses where interventions like agroforestry could be undertaken. We see that there is immense potential for landscape restoration. And if landscape restoration and forest protection is implemented at scale in India, there could be 3 to 4.3 gigaton additional above ground carbon that could be sequestered through forest protection and restoration by 2040. To just give you an equivalent, this would be reducing emissions of roughly, equivalent of reducing emissions for 2.8 billion passenger vehicles over 20 years. So we see that there is huge potential for nature-based solutions and landscape restoration in the country. Just to kind of zoom out a bit, globally, there is a lot of estimations on landscape protection and restoration. We see that a lot of countries are working on atlases like the one which I showed in the slide earlier. And governments, decision makers are thinking through in terms of how do we develop strategies for restoration which are inclusive, which consider people in the landscape, and I can make people, bring people to the center stage who are driving restoration on the ground. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the work and some of the learnings that are coming from Sidhi district in eastern Madhya Pradesh, as you see on the map. Taking the use case of restoration in a landscape context, as I said earlier, there is immense potential for landscape restoration in India. If we look at central India or Madhya Pradesh, which you see the map in the middle, we see that there is immense potential there as well. And policymakers, civil society, researchers, practitioners could use some of the data that's available to plan for which areas one can prioritize when we plan for restoration. Of course, there are areas that should be excluded. Like in the India Atlas, we've excluded areas where ecologically restoration would not be appropriate. Also at the national level, it would not be, we've also excluded irrigated areas because we realize there could be huge trade-offs with food security. But overall, the Atlas at the national level helps in prioritizing which areas could be prioritized for restoration. But the question that arises is, how do we, if we know which areas to prioritize, how do you design restoration strategies in a district or jurisdictions so that it could lead to multiple benefits? IUCN and WRI globally has developed a tool called Restoration Opportunity Assessment Methodology. It's been applied in more than 40 countries, which answers some of the key questions around who are the key stakeholders, what information is needed when planning for restoration, why restore, what sort of intervention should be undertaken, where they could be undertaken, and how does one do that? So Rome basically assesses the questions around, where, what, and also a cost benefit analysis in terms of how you do it, and also the finance for restoration, who would pay for it. So some estimations around that. We adjusted the global Rome framework for a economically poor and climate vulnerable district, which Mr. Srivastava was talking about earlier. Sidhi district in eastern Madhya Pradesh is one which has several developmental challenges in terms of poor access to energy, clean water, etc. And people sustain on land for their and forests for their survival. And so we started with thinking, if while we are building a shared understanding for restoration in poor impoverished districts like Sidhi, how do we also bring in some of the concerns around livelihoods and economic opportunities that could flow in from restoration on the ground? So the example of Sidhi district would have a lot of learnings across for other districts in India as well as globally. And how did we do this? So when we were making adjustments to Rome for the Indian context as well as for Sidhi, we paid more attention, closer attention to some of the social inclusion and governance aspects. We specifically looked at what are the key livelihood benefits in short, medium, and long term that can flow from implementation of restoration. We paid attention to actor network relationships that are very crucial when planning for restoration, and the flow of multiple ecosystem services. Carbon is important, but also thinking through in terms of some of the other ecosystem services like biodiversity, fuel wood fodder, which fuel wood and fodder primarily came up very high in terms of the local priorities when we were doing our consultations. While we were adapting the Rome, we followed an iterative adaptive approach, and we focused on developing participatory consultative tools. For instance, we used the global framework which identifies key success factors and challenges for restoration and developed it into a card game. We also developed the ecosystem services diagnostic based on some of the research that UFRO has done. We created a baseline of tree cover and count using FAO's collector tool, and we did it through a participatory method where we brought together people from the landscape as well as people who have experience in remote sensing and GIS to kind of map out the baseline as well as see what are the potential areas. And we focused more attention on actor network relationships. We did this over about 2 years in consultation with more than 600 participants. As I was saying earlier, so how did we do this? So we did consultations at the district level, sub-district level. We also did several focus group discussions at the village level and one-to-one interviews to kind of identify key land use challenges, what are the priorities that are emerging from the district, and then accordingly, we sort of came up with a restoration opportunity assessment and some of the findings that came out. We validated the findings several times as well. So what are the key recommendations from the Sidhi's assessment study? What we find is there is immense social and economic benefits that can flow from restoration. There's a wealth of restoration opportunity in more than 300,000 hectares in Sidhi district. And through a series of accelerator, which is a time-bound sort of a program which brings together stakeholders and equips them with capacities, knowledge that might be needed to break through barriers to success and restore more land faster. Just to give an example of accelerators that we have recommended in the study, they are around policy, knowledge, and land accelerator or business accelerators. As Mr. Godrej mentioned earlier, the Land Accelerator South Asia was launched in India this year. We in fact had the demo day for Land Accelerator last week, where we heard very innovative pitches from 15 entrepreneurs from India and Sri Lanka, talking about the fantastic work they have been doing on restoring farms and forests across the country. So the map that you see on the screen showcases the opportunity for restoration, conservation, and protection in Sidhi district. The areas that are in light green are the areas which are primarily protected areas, about 19% of the land. And these are the areas which have been prioritized for protection, conservation in the district. The areas that you see in green are dark green are the areas where there is high canopy cover, and these are forests outside forest areas, and these are the areas which have been recommended for protection. We also have, and the areas in yellow are the areas where we've identified restoration opportunity, and we've identified in the report at least 8 interventions where WADI or agri-hortiforestry, trees on bunds or boundaries, farmer managed natural regeneration, etc., can be implemented. Just in terms of to read the graph, what you see, and the analysis here is being presented at the sub-district level to identify different interventions that are feasible in a sub-district in Sidhi. They could have been just more than 8 interventions, but we prioritize the interventions which came out more in terms of which are more socially inclusive and also were prioritized by local farmers, stakeholders during the discussions. And some of these interventions, the 8 interventions that we've identified, can address several land use challenges that Sidhi district faces. And Mr. Srivastava talked about a lot of that earlier. So in terms of, there has been a change from natural forests to monoculture plantations in the district, low productivity of land, soil erosion, over-extraction of fuel wood and non-timber forest produce, inadequate fodder are some of the challenges that Sidhi's population is dealing with. And through some of these interventions identified, there are multiple ecosystem services that could flow. Of course, there would have to be policy interventions that would have to be undertaken around to make sure land tenure and resource rights are secured, market linkages are developed so that the benefits can flow from the interventions identified. But there is a good reason to do that, as we realize that there is immense economic potential from restoration in Sidhi district. Working with our partner, Institute of Livelihood Research and Training, we identified there are 6 value chains that can be developed around 60 tree species of bamboo, mahua, palash, jackfruit, Indian gooseberry, and moringa, which could create in a poor, economically impoverished district like Sidhi, 30,000 jobs through 3,000 micro enterprises, and could lead to 7 million tons of carbon sequestration over 10 years only in forest areas. Of course, there is a lot of, by planting of saplings, the 3.75 million days of employment can be created. And there could be 1.3 billion of extra income from wage and sale of saplings in Sidhi district if restoration is implemented at scale. One of the important sort of our learning while implementing this was, and which restoration projects across the world would also have to consider, is what are the local priorities that emerge from different interventions from restoration. So our analysis indicates that there are differentiated priorities based on caste, class, and gender in terms of what ecosystem services people are looking for from when restoration is implemented on the ground. For instance, women prioritize provisioning services such as fuel wood and fodder, while men prioritize regulatory services such as biodiversity, soil erosion, etc. And there are several enabling policies in place for the restoration interventions that we've identified, which could help in its implementation. And this was the work which was done in partnership with the Center for Environment Law, WRI of India. And what we did identify is, I mean, it's great that these enabling policies are in place, but for restoration projects to be successful, they need clarification on the ground so that one can create successful restoration with secure tenure and resource rights for people so that benefits can flow. What you see on the map is our analysis from social landscape analysis. We basically looked at identifying the actor network relationships, which are very crucial to understand when we plan for restoration in a landscape. And from the map, it would look like that this is a very large and diverse landscape. which it is a large network, but it lacks diversity of actors. And one of our finding has been that if we have to steer landscape restoration in the district, some of the actors who are in the periphery of the network, like civil society organizations, research institutions, etc., need to come to the fore as well. District administration, farmers, and local champions emerge key for implementing and scaling restoration in the district. Just as in terms of the way forward, I think we are quite excited about the partnership with the Madhya Pradesh government, as Mr. Srivastava also indicated. And now the focus would be on how do we build these collaborative synergistic plans that can restore land faster, but taking into consideration local people's rights, and also considering the ecosystem, what the priorities are, and for the development. And nature-based solution overall, and examples of Sidhi and when scaled up in Madhya Pradesh and across, some of these examples show that some of the international commitments that Government of India has made under the Bond Challenge, there are several SDGs that align to it, but I've mentioned a few here. And very strong alliance with also looking at the Paris Climate Agreement goals that India has. Some of these could be met if nature-based solutions are implemented at scale. Of course, Government of India's several of the missions and targets are already in place, including the vision to doubling farmers' income. And these solutions could help in supporting and implementing it. This work would not have been possible without the support of JEF, UN Environment and Good Energies Foundation. We are very grateful for their support. And of course, to our local partners and stakeholders, and Institute of Livelihood Research and Training, Bhopal, as well as Center for Environmental Law, WWF of India. Thank you so much. And we are very excited about this.
Thanks so much, Ruchika. Ruchika had led this work, and the extent of her involvement is clearly evident from the depth of the presentation that she had made. We are extremely proud of this partnership. I think it's an excellent example of showing how a government and civil society and think tanks can come together for implementing this kind of work in a rural environment. And I'm particularly happy with my team having done this work, because Sidhi is not a very easy to access place. And despite its remoteness, the team put in all their work into it, all the effort into it, and came up with this report. I'm really proud that this team has been able to take it up. But the one person who was of great help while we were doing this work was Mr. R. Parshuram. Mr. Parshuram was also a member of the Indian Administrative Service. He was the Chief Secretary of the state government, the Chief Secretary of Madhya Pradesh. And after that, for about 5 years, he also served as a state election commissioner. Now, in his case, I'm not wrong. He was the district collector of Sidhi several years ago. In the case of Mr. Srivastava, I made a mistake. Mr. Parshuram, I know he was there. We're in fact very proud to now have him amongst us as a senior fellow with WRI India. And given his experience in Madhya Pradesh and the years that he spent there, I would invite him to give us some of his perspectives on this effort. Mr. Parshuram.
Thank you, OP. In fact, I sent you a WhatsApp message saying that, OP, please don't call me Mr. Parshuram, call me Parshu or Parshuram, as my friends do. I think you haven't seen that. But thank you so much for not only inviting me to be on board on this project, but also for the kind of association opportunities I've had to be with your team led by Ruchika in these last few months. For me, today is an important day, in fact, a very important day in my life, and I'm not exaggerating. Sidhi is a district where I have lived and worked. Of course, I left the district, living there, I left some almost 35 years ago or a little more. But I've been associated off and on with things that have happened in Sidhi. More so now with my involvement with WRI. And it gives me immense pleasure, and it's a matter of great satisfaction that this report on which Ruchika just now made a very impressive presentation has come out with the hope that whatever it seeks to implement, whatever it embodies in its on its pages and photographs, actually would turn into reality with the kind of support or an involvement that WRI has been able to leverage not nationally and internationally, and the kind of wholehearted support which it has received from the government of Madhya Pradesh, led here by my colleague, my former colleague, if I may, but a friend, Mr. Manoj Srivastav, who occupies the chair today, where I used to sit some 10 years ago. So, so this is something which really is an important day for me. Today, in fact, if I may say so, a large number of people who are in the audience, some of them are also the district team from Sidhi, as well as the CSO organizations from within Madhya Pradesh, many of them who are very much interested in seeing things go forward in Sidhi. I will only try and build on some points because after Ruchika's presentation, I really don't have to go into the details. What I want to say is that a lot of things have changed in Sidhi for the better and for worse. All over India, we have seen a lot of development happening. People's lives have improved. Levels of poverty have decreased and reduced. But at the same time, if you go to a rural setting like in Sidhi, you find that life is full of challenges. Making a living is a challenge. Outward migration for seasonal and long-term employment is a continued reality. All this happens when a lot of work has continued to happen in Sidhi itself. So what has gone missing? In the last 35 years that I have been associated with Sidhi, and let me also, as an aside, say one more thing. Sidhi, the word itself in Hindi means straight, everything that is straight. But Sidhi's landscape is such an undulating landscape that there is not even a 200-meter stretch of road which runs straight. It's full of ridges and valleys. And before we started formally this webinar today, Mr. Godrej was asking us about Sidhi and the rivers that flow through Sidhi. There are major rivers which flow through Sidhi. It has also therefore resulted in some very good surface water schemes, but those are limited to the narrow valleys in the district. Large part of the district, which is very undulating, is still dependent on groundwater recharge as well as on soil moisture content. So therefore, forests and retention of moisture, avoiding soil erosion, all these things are issues which need to be tackled in a far more concerted manner than perhaps we have achieved up till now. Manoj was very clear about the kind of programs that can support the effort that we may put in here. This project report by itself talks of going in for land restoration through plantation. It also talks about convergence of funds, both government funds through programs, as well as attracting other investments from multilateral agencies maybe, or for bilateral funding. Or the instrumentalities are all there. What is probably required is to deepen convergent action and at the local level, for which the government of Madhya Pradesh has come forward very willingly and said that we are willing to look at this happen, number one. Whereas we do talk of climate change more often than not, what happens and what you see in the media, it's generally about what's happening at the national level and internationally. but the action always has to be at the local level. Now, in Sidhi, probably is a district which, I mean, you can perhaps think of a better district. There will be several other districts like Sidhi in India, but Sidhi certainly is one of the most climatically challenged districts. Long back in the history of development, if you look at in India, in the 1970s and 80s, we used to have a program called the Drought Prone Area Development Program. Now, which means that this was centered on or focused on districts which were prone to droughts arising out of insufficient rainfall because of monsoon failure. And the 6 districts in Madhya Pradesh which were in this list, this all India list of districts which were most challenged, Sidhi was one of them. Even today, despite the fact that there is some irrigation, there is a lot of exploitation of groundwater, much more than what it ever used to be. We haven't really given people their due in agriculture, and therefore for earning their livelihoods. And this project can really bring in a lot of such convergent action together. The institutional arrangements are there. They only need to be strengthened and deepened. People are willing, as Ruchika pointed out in her presentation. This report itself is the outcome of a very intense discussion at the local level. It's not as if somebody has sat in the national and the state capital and produced the report. It's a lot of field work has gone in, a lot of local interaction and engagement has gone in. Whatever has been said in the report actually has come from what people there in the villages, in the panchayats have asked for, what not merely what the local leaders think and want, but also what a common farmer, a subsistence farmer, a small farmer, a small farmer whose part of his family migrates seasonally to other better endowed areas. They have all their views have been taken into account, and this is a result and outcome of that exercise, of which I'm immensely proud for my association, informally and formally, in the last 3 or 4 years. I had this good fortune of even chairing one big session in a way forward workshop in Sidhi some 2 years ago, where the findings at a draft stage was discussed, and with people, a large number of people participating. And whatever they said there, and these included not only the local community, but also the civil society and small and marginal farmers, men and women, and people from the scheduled tribes, who form a significant proportion of the population in the district. All those things have been taken on board. And what is probably needs to be emphasized more is the fact that it's a very forward-looking report. It doesn't stop at doing a few things and then saying that it's all done. What it also connects with is the integrated approach to which we probably need to go back to. Of late in India, the development programs have tended to be individual and family-centric. But when we talk of natural capital and the natural endowment, which is under pressure, we need to look at it afresh. Again, as Manoj mentioned, we used to have a very strong watershed development program. So this approach for landscape restoration, land restoration on a landscape approach or landscape denominated approach, can probably not only set an example for how to upscale it within the district, but also would probably serve as an exemplar for both other areas of Madhya Pradesh, and indeed for the rest of the country, where the challenges are similar. And it's coming right before the commencement of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. So I'm probably at the right time. Therefore, this is the right program for the people who need it, by the people, to be implemented by the people who want it, at the beginning of this huge worldwide effort on ecosystem restoration. And with that, I would like to once again thank you, OP, and the rest of the WRI team for allowing me to be associated with the project. And of course, with Manoj Srivastava and the government of Madhya Pradesh officers, with whom this project has given me the opportunity of continue my linkage with them. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Parshuram. I have replied to your WhatsApp message, but to just sort of amplify what you said, I was part of that workshop that you spoke about in Sidhi about 2 years ago. And the one thing that I must say is the way you bonded with various stakeholders who came to that. It really showed the passion with which you were the district collector of Sidhi and kept going back to that place. And that kind of bonding is something that is rare to see. And if it wasn't for your help and your support, I'm not sure how far we have been able to go in completing this work. So thank you, a big thank you to you. We look forward to your guidance and support in the years to come as we work with Manoj on getting this further off the ground. As you very rightly say, we are hoping that this will be a demonstration of the good that can come out of the UN Decade on Restoration. Thank you very much for all your support so far. So friends, with this, we complete the first part of this webinar today. It's now time to move on to the sort of panel discussion on unlocking finance for ecosystem restoration. And for this, I will invite my colleague and dear friend, Sean Devitt. Sean is the director of the Global Restoration Initiative in our global office in WRI. Sean has a very close connect to India. He's very passionate about India. It's a real delight that he's there with us. And I'll now request Sean to take forward this panel discussion and also introduce the panelists on this. Over to you, Sean.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, OP. So thank you so much. Welcome to the panel session. I've been asked to share a few opening slides. And so I will do that now, and then I will turn to our esteemed panelists in just a couple of minutes. So the question at hand, and then we've heard this as a thread throughout the opening remarks from our esteemed colleagues, is what are these concrete steps that we can take to unlock finance for restoring landscapes? And first, I just wanted to highlight, this is from the Credit Suisse 2014 report that looked at conservation and restoration finance. And just to say that we do still face an enormous global gap. You see here, these are numbers from 2014, but they've only increased incrementally. We see about 40 billion in public funding and about 10 billion in private funding, leaving us with this shortfall of about 300 billion per year. And with our experience, even some of the money that's been earmarked by impact investors and others has had trouble flowing onto the ground into restoration projects. So why is that? We put together an analysis, and we will share these slides with you. But we looked at the barriers for restoration finance, and we found that there were 9 themes that just kept emerging. The first are related to some of the project characteristics, that restoration projects often do have a longer time horizon. They are new onto the scene, relatively speaking, and so they are considered risky. And the projects are often small. Some of the impact investors we work with are looking for project sizes that are larger to justify the due diligence on the investment that's required. So we see a mismatch there. The second are around some of the enabling factors. First, we've seen that there are a lack of incentives, and these can be financial incentives, but also incentives related to land tenure and other issues that can stand in the way of restoration, or just incentives from other sectors that are just larger than incentives to restore land. But also, oftentimes, the coherence among policies across sectors across different scales, whether that be national, state, or local. They often lack coherence. One policy may be heading in a certain direction in one sector at one scale, but then there's another policy heading in a different direction. And so you've heard a common theme of convergent action, and this could be very, very helpful in this space as well. There are also some market forces that are hindering some of the placement of restoration finance. We see a mismatch of capital and needs, often very high interest rates and/or collateral requirements, too short of a loan term to be able to deal with that long time horizon that is required for these projects. But also some of the market linkages are often missing. Now we see some market linkages for eucalyptus and pine, teak, some of the more common economic species, but especially for native species, there's a lot of work to be done to strengthen those market linkages. And lastly, around capacity. Why we've seen some challenge in having even the money earmarked for restoration flow is that first, the technical capacity is sometimes lacking. Partnering with Mother Nature does require knowledge of what species and in what place, based on a number of biophysical and social factors. But also the investment readiness is sometimes low, ensuring that the right team, that the right business model and the right operating models are in place to allow these projects to grow. And so with that, looking at the Sidhi report, there were more than 350,000 hectares of restoration opportunity identified within those 8 interventions that Ruchika mentioned. The overall cost was estimated to be somewhere between around 4,000 and 7,000 million Indian rupees, or between 65 and 111 million US dollars over 5 to 10 years. And I mean, the good news is that there are existing flows of finance, some gaps, but even those existing flows, again, coming back to this theme of convergent action, are fragmented, and they've proven to be insufficient thus far. And so this convergent action seems to be an urgent issue to be addressed. And lastly, the costs do vary widely depending on the type of the restoration intervention and the actors assumed to carry it forward. Here on this graph, it shows the 8 interventions across the bottom. They range from trees on boundaries, the agri-hortiforestry, to assisted natural regeneration, bamboo plantations, mixed species plantations. There's 2 key takeaways from this slide. The blue markers show the average cost of restoration, and you see the number of Indian rupees on the left axis. And then the orange line shows the number of hectares that are available in Sidhi district for these. And the main takeaway from this slide is just that there really is no one size fits all. We sometimes talk about restoration as though it's one project or one intervention, but actually it's quite a big tent with quite a few different interventions inside of them. Some of them generate public benefits and so warrant more public financing. Others generate private benefits, so warrant more private benefits. Others are mixed, warranting blended finance. And you see, this is a graphic taken from the report, looking at the different types of financing that are available. And it first looks at the sources of financing. For these sources, you'll see a check mark means these things are already in place. A plus sign means that there's opportunities for new sources. But already there's government funding, there's development bank funding from NABARD and others, retail banks, private funding, multilateral funding, with opportunities for bilateral funding. The channels through which they're flowing include government agencies, research and extension, the private sector, as well as nonprofit intermediaries. But on the mechanisms that are developed in Sidhi district, you see fewer check marks and more plus signs, so more opportunity and fewer things in place. So there are some public expenditures already, there are some grants and loans, but you see opportunities for other mechanisms, tax incentives, guarantees, bonds, market payments, and to realize these interventions. And again, this idea of convergent action is really key. These are quite fragmented at the moment in Sidhi district and across India and across, frankly, the world. So there's a lot of work to be done in bringing these together. Now, how do these things come together in landscapes? This is the last slide I wanted to show before we turn to our panel. And I'd seen some questions in the chat as well about, how do I get financing into my landscape? And we've circled in blue usually where we think about the financing. This is around effective implementation. How do I just get this moving and plant, or fence, so I can realize restoration? But this graphic is taken from a great little book called the Little Sustainable Landscapes book from Global Canopy, and it tries to highlight the steps that are needed in a landscape in order to get good landscape management going. And it really starts at the top with this multi-stakeholder platform. We know that these solutions are very local, right? And it requires local leadership from a wide variety of folks, from subnational government, from the private sector, from communities, civil society. Those folks need to come together to develop a shared understanding of what's possible. And this is where these kind of Rome reports, like we're launching today, can be very, very helpful. That's going to tell you what's possible, but then a collaborative planning exercise needs to be undertaken to say, okay, from what's possible, what are we going to do? What do we agree as a multi-stakeholder platform to do? Based on those plans, then financing can be mobilized behind them. And that's usually a mix of public and private and blended finance. And then that implementation needs to then be monitored effectively to know the results of that finance, to then feed back into this multi-stakeholder platform and to feed that information back to the financiers that are funding restoration. So with that, there's a lot of different ways to look at how we need to finance restoration along that chain. And we're very pleased and honored to have with us today 3 esteemed panelists to answer this question. What are the concrete steps we need to take to unlock finance for restoring landscapes? And what I'd like to do is I'll introduce each of the panelists, and I'd like to give them 3 or 4 minutes to respond to their initial response to this question. And then I'll introduce the next panelist. And then when we finish, we'll open for Q&A for the audience. So I encourage all of you to please type your questions into the Q&A now. We'll be screening through those. And yeah, we'd love to include your question. So first, let me introduce Dr. Ashok Khosla. Dr. Khosla also needs very little introduction, but I will provide some introductory remarks because of his amazing experience. He is the chairman of the Development Alternatives Group, a social enterprise dedicated to a sustainable future for all. Earlier, he was the director of the Office of Environment for the Government of India and the director of Infoterra, the information system of the United Nations Environment Program. He has served as the co-chair of the International Resource Panel and the president of IUCN and the Club of Rome. We as WRI India are very grateful for his service as a board member as well. Dr. Khosla is a pioneer in this intersection of environment and development sustainability with tremendous impact in India, but also internationally. Amazingly, he taught in the first university course on the environment at Harvard University. He established the first government agency for the environment in a developing country in India. He created the first international information system on the environment, Infoterra, at UNEP, and he founded the first social enterprise for sustainable development, the Development Alternatives Group. So among his honors and awards, he is an officer of the Order of the British Empire. He has received the UN Sasakawa Environment Prize, the Zayed International Environment Prize, and WWF's Duke of Edinburgh Medal for Conservation. He studied natural sciences at Cambridge University and holds a PhD in experimental physics from Harvard University. So with that incredible introduction, Dr. Khosla, we'd love to hear from you, your thoughts on how we can finance restoration in landscapes.
Well, Sean, it was a bit not only incredible introduction, but you took up half my time. So now I'm going to be limited to about 3 minutes to answer a question that has been so well addressed by all the speakers already that I hope I can do a little bit of justice in the few minutes that I have. Personally, I think unlocking finance for restoration is probably the wrong question, or at least it's only half right. Any long-term, long gestation period intervention does need investment, it does need financing, no question about that. But where we are falling short is finding ways to reduce the costs so that the kind of investments needed are really more manageable. You know, the important issue is to reach the goals of restoration, forests and other landscapes, and to do so in a way that we can speed up the process without having to keep shaking down the tree of international or national finance. There are different ways to reach these goals, and raising funds is certainly one of these. And you know, most of them have been covered. Revenues from payments for ecosystem services, revenues from products being sold from those restoration interventions, revenues from local enterprises and communities that benefit from this, commons. And common property resources deserve government taxpayer support. I mean, there's no question that they have a right to access national or regional funds. And then we've mentioned carbon credits and offsets and co-benefits with biodiversity. So there are whole ways of raising funds. Much more interesting, I think, in view of the fact that people don't like to spend money, is to reduce the costs. And that, I think, my own organization's foray into this area has led us to believe that natural regeneration of all kinds, assisted, farmers, etc., is actually probably the major way to go forward. It not only takes care of the issue of species, which are usually local if it's natural regeneration, but nature is really incredibly strong and powerful and resilient. And we found that this is a terrific way to save landscapes and to regenerate them. Agri-horticulture, the WADI that Ruchika was referring to in her slides, is also an area. It needs a little more sophistication than the way we've been doing it in the past. But it seems to me that from an economic point of view for the farmer, this is a terrific way to go forward. Nature-based methods for land improvement. The whole area of vetiver grass for land terracing. In Fiji right now, they're doing some incredible work in these areas, in a little, Pacific island. But we've seen these happen in India and in other places. I'm a firm believer in biomimicry, in learning from nature and being inspired by nature to do things that basically cost a lot less and deliver much bigger results. The amazing project in Berlin, for example, of recycling used baby diapers into making trees is a phenomenal example of how you use nature to teach you how to recycle and circularize your local economy. And I would certainly like to think that there are many others. But ultimately, what has really worked in the past is voluntary action, a lot of it. I mean, Korea went from about 4% of its land area under forest at the end of the Korean War to 65% within literally less than a decade, by almost entirely, I wouldn't call it voluntary, it was more forced than voluntary, but it was action by people, by everyone, by the whole country, going out there and spending their entire vacations planting trees. And you can see an amazing result from that. Faith-based institutions. We've had some incredible results from people working using faith-based motivation to plant trees on a very large scale. In Pakistan, the billion-tree tsunami is an interesting example. It illustrates not only what is doable, but also the need for transparency and accountability. These are things that you essentially have to do if you want to do these on a large scale. Now, my 3 minutes are up. So all I can say is that we need now not only transparency and accountability, but we need a readjustment of our legal systems to allow forest lands to be opened up for this kind of work by other actors, including civil society, including other kinds of sectors, including private industry. And I think that would be a major breakthrough in thinking if we could do that in India. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Khosla. Thanks for reminding us of the power of natural regeneration, often underappreciated. We agree, the power of people and mobilization and the importance of these enabling frameworks. So thank you so much for your remarks, Dr. Khosla. Next, let me please introduce my colleague, Ms. Wanjira Mathai. Wanjira is the Vice President and Regional Director of WRI Africa. She is the current chair of the Wangari Maathai Foundation and the former chair of the Greenbelt Movement in Kenya. She also graciously served as the co-chair of the Global Restoration Council for several years. As an inspiring leader, Wanjira has over 20 years of experience advocating for social and environmental change at both local and international levels. Wanjira is dedicated to raising the visibility of climate change, youth leadership, sustainable energy, landscape restoration, really championing the central role that women and youth must play in creating our sustainable future. She serves on the board of the World Agroforestry Center, ECRAF, and as an advisory council member on the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves. And lastly, Wanjira was named one of the 100 most influential African women in 2018 and again in 2020. Wanjira, thank you for joining us, and please, over to you.
Thank you, Sean. That's a lot, but really a privilege to be here, and thank you for all the remarks that have gone before. Really, really interesting. For us, I mean, Sean, there's so many reasons why we must invest. These are interesting times, and climate change remains, I think, the existential crisis and the most existential issue of our time. But it has also been exposing in the last few months the inequities, the vulnerabilities of our world today. We are living in increasingly challenging times, facing multiple compound risks, the climate change, of course, the pandemic, the economic crisis, and I think the growing inequality that is raising both anxiety, but also deeper, putting people into even greater vulnerability. Now, the fact is we've done really well in fighting poverty over the many years past, but poverty is, believe it or not, expected to increase for the first time in 22 years because of the big shocks that we've gone through recently. And now what's dangerous about this is that the demographic that is falling into poverty are those that are actually at the margins. They are people in the informal sector who are running businesses, entrepreneurs who are working hard, a lot of them youth and women. And these are often invisible to state systems and to databases that would otherwise provide social support if it's there. So even as part of the recovery, every opportunity we have to turbocharge entrepreneurship would be transformative. And the extent to which we can build resilience as we do that, even better. And I think that's why the opportunities presented by nature-based solutions, and in particular by restoration and safeguarding of forests, really, really important. And Ruchika's presentation made it very clear the significant benefits that communities stand to gain. So that I think is really important. But to put it briefly, we do need to invest in helping entrepreneurs and young people who are restoring land. Many of them are ambitious, they are energetic, but they really do not have our support. The opportunity, in many ways, I say when I talk to them and listen to them, is somewhat of a mirage, because the restoration opportunity seems there, but the financing is not there. The technical capacity is not there. And so we need to be really, and some of your barriers spotlighted that. But we know that there are shining examples of people who are doing it. Malawi, for example, have been very inspired by the fact that they're activating a youth movement in restoration that is quite groundbreaking, committing 1.5% of their domestic budget to a youth restoration initiative, providing that sort of employment to thousands of young people as they at the same time restore landscapes. The great news is, and I always like to remember, that restoration and nature-based solutions in general provide a third of the climate solution. So we cannot ignore the mitigation and adaptation benefits of restoration. And we must therefore put in our minds the mindset that not only can we do it, rather how do we do it? How do we de-risk? How do we get over all of those barriers that you talked about? Because not only is it the right thing to do, it is the most economically opportune thing to do at the moment. And so we know there are many ambitious entrepreneurs across the region, also in South Asia and in India in particular, where we are discussing. Many of them want to bring prosperity to their lives and to the lives of the communities where they live. We've talked to some of them through the webinars we've had with UNEP and the African Restoration Initiative, and the message is often the same. We don't have the technical support. We don't have the funding to make this possible, but there are tools, and I'm really proud that at WRI, certainly that we have the Land Accelerator, for example, that is continuing to bring and support entrepreneurs and improve their business models so that they can access finance and they can share the best practice with each other. And I know that very recently, India held its very first Land Accelerator, and I hope that was the first of many to come. And expanding these sorts of programs, Sean, is what will help us reach more entrepreneurs, turbocharge the restoration movement. And then finally, one of my favorite opportunities, and unfortunately COVID has put a stop to our ability to visit each other and have exchange visits, connecting leaders from across the regions, sharing best practice. And, you know, Africa, South Asia, Latin America, we need to learn from each other. We need to avoid the roadblocks to implementation that we've seen and begin to create real opportunities and share what's working well. I really enjoyed the presentation that Ruchika gave about Sidhi, because it does in so many ways remind me of some of the landscapes right here in Kenya. And last week I was part of a restoration roundtable where consensus is developing that we need to put a priority on restoration. And so we have so much in common, so much to learn from each other. And so Sean, I wish we could make sure that these exchange visits begin, and maybe even virtually to start, because there is already, we have everything we need to turbocharge this movement. We just need to connect. And I think in this UN Decade for Restoration, certainly through COP26, COP27 will be an African COP, we have got to make this COP work and make it count for youth, entrepreneurs, and nature-based solutions. So it's a triple win as far as I'm concerned: the environment, social equity, health and communities, and the entire suite of ecosystem services that flow from it. Now is really the time to invest in restoration, to invest in people, and achieve this triple win. Thanks, Sean.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Wanjira, for your remarks and for reminding us of the importance of that human connection and of supporting our entrepreneurs, these brave, courageous souls that enter this sector. Indeed, we've had more than 1,600 entrepreneurs apply to the Land Accelerator programs in the last 2 years, and we've only been able to engage 50 of them so far. And so there's a huge opportunity here for further engagement. So thank you so much, Wanjira. I'd like to now introduce our concluding panelist, Edel Montero. Edel, warmest welcome to you. Edel is the program lead at the India Climate Collaborative. She holds her master's degree at this intersection of environment and sustainable development from University College London. She has over a decade of experience in sustainability and climate action, both in consultancies and in the nonprofit sector. She leads the ICC's work on land use with a focus on natural farming as a nature-based solution to climate change. And she previously worked on climate advocacy and knowledge building with the Center of Environmental Research and Education, and on market-linked climate smart agriculture and landscape management with IDH, the Dutch Sustainable Trade Initiative. So with that, Edel, we'd love to hear your remarks on financing restoration. Over to you.
Thank you, Sean. Can I be heard? Hello?
Yeah.
Yes, we hear you well, Edel. Thank you.
Great. So let me start by congratulating WRI on this critical piece of work, because I actually think it's very much relevant to this conversation around unlocking finance for restoration. Primarily because I think it addresses some of the barriers to finance, this lack of recognition of incentives to restore land, and this belief that environmental social benefits have no market value. Specifically, I think what the report does well is it highlights the additional employment and the expected wage income generated. I think this moves the discussion from theoretical sector claims to very tangible expected outputs in this specific local scenario. And I think this narrative on livelihoods is very critical in this moment of time, as we talk about post-pandemic economic recovery, but also green recovery investment strategies. we need to ensure that restoration and landscape interventions take their rightful place in those discussions. In general, as we consider unlocking finance or restoration, the starting point logically has to be strategies that address some of the barriers to both existing and potential sources of finance. Some of these have been mentioned: poor accountability mechanisms, high transaction costs, both for the funder, but also those accessing funds, and also maybe lack of institutional capacity and coordination. I think maybe blending sources of finance will also be critical, but it should be by design rather than convenience and availability. That is, this will require some sort of matching of the type of finance and funding to its most appropriate use. As Sean highlighted earlier, there is a global finance cap for restoration. And keeping in mind the volume required to scale restoration beyond specific projects and clusters, I think it is very important that we stimulate commercial and private investments where applicable. But for this, what we need is a paradigm shift in the way in which private sector views investment opportunities in restoration and how public and concessional investors catalyze private capital. So could, for example, DFIs and multilateral banks shift even more focus towards private sector mobilization? Could they do this by supporting pipeline development, maybe providing concessional capital, or even improving market incentives? We know that in India, at least, public money is the most available source of current finance, but it's currently structured to deliver direct implementation activities. Is it possible to consider expanding the range of public financing instruments? So to include blended and hybrid products, or to have the government guarantees to encourage maybe corporate sector partnerships. I also think maybe public sector money could be used to build critical sector infrastructure like institutional capacity, those monitoring systems and incentive mechanisms. Lastly, grant money can be strategically deployed to build local capacities or maybe fund critical data and knowledge. And reflecting on the conversations within the philanthropic networks that the ICC is part of, there definitely appears to be a significant number of major donors currently in strategic planning and realignment mode in preparation for what's been discussed here very well, the 2030 decade of action. Many are expanding their portfolios. They're moving climate solutions beyond energy to include nature-based solutions to climate change. So we think that the next 2 to 3 months, short enough time frame, is actually a very, very critical time to firmly entrench landscape restoration within their long-term plans. I'll stop here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Edel. Yes, and you touched on one question that I had seen in the chat. I know we're nearly at time here, but I wanted to just maybe take time for 2 questions, and then maybe we can answer other questions that are in the chat via email together. There's been a question about blended finance and landscape portfolios for finance, and if folks have seen good examples either in Sidhi district itself or in other areas where we've seen effective blending. And just curious, Edel, if you wanted to take the first stab at that question. Oops, Edel, did we lose you? We may have lost Edel, so we can come back to her. Curious, Dr. Khosla Wanjira, any perspective on this blending or landscape mechanisms, or Ruchika as well, given your work in Sidhi district?
I could take a stab at 1 or 2 aspects of that, not from Sidhi, from experience in Sidhi, but our need to blend not so much finance, but blend small projects into large aggregation of projects. Because a large part of the issue that also appeared in your slideshow is that the small projects are small and the funding agencies can't deal with them. And one kind of blending that we need is how to aggregate projects of various types for delivering in a blended manner to funding agencies. And I think, cluster development of enterprises of various types We've recently done a project in Burkina Faso doing shea butter. Shea butter is a very interesting way of restoring landscapes because it's one of those things that you can't plant in a plantation. It grows in the wild, it's got to be collected, and it's an extremely valuable product with very high potential price in the market. So we've seen that it's impossible really to get financing for one small micro enterprise. But if you can cluster these, and we've had some success doing that. The government of India has actually, in its wisdom, introduced a very interesting program called Sfurti, S-F-U-R-T-I, which takes traditional industries and puts them together geographically or virtually into clusters that can be supported by common services. And these are the kinds of things I think we've got to look at in order to generate the kinds of revenues from the ecosystem services or the products of landscape restoration into the market. And I believe that kind of blending is really has a big future. The other kind of blending that you're talking about, whether it's loans and equity, this and that, are also important. But basically, I think what's holding us up is your number 5 or number 6, whatever it was, obstacle, which is essentially that the small entrepreneurs are not able to access money, and we've got to figure out a way to do that. And whether it's carbon credits or it's money from the bank or whatever, this is really a major breakthrough idea.
Terrific. Thank you so much for that emphasis, Dr. Khosla, and I agree entirely. Maybe we have time for one last question, and perhaps Wanjira, I could direct this question to you. There are quite a few questions in the chat related to local organizations and people working on the ground, and just the central importance of people as the engine that are going to drive restoration solutions forward. Are there some solutions, suggestions for how finance can do a better job of reaching these local organizations and people working on the ground? We've heard Dr. Khosla mention the importance of clustering. Are there other aspects based on your experience that you would like to highlight?
Well, Sean, that really good question, and that is actually the big question and gap in financing at the moment. As you mentioned, some of these quite small and not even qualifying for some of the smaller investment funding because of the nature of them. But the truth of the matter is that's where implementation is happening. And it is at that scale multiplied 1,000 times that we have to figure out how to make it happen. At the moment, when you look at the fact that restoration is a third of, and nature-based solutions are a third of the climate solution, we've got to figure out how to finance it, because it's not enough to say that they have to be large projects, because we know that restoration at the community level has significant multiple benefits. And the truth of the matter is, as well, is that those benefits flow to the community level, to the family level, and that is the rate at which the sustainability of restoration in particular can be maintained. When you look at the landscape that even Sidhi, when we were looking at that presentation, you can see it's around those homes, it's around communities and the ownership, the co-management of some of these forests. In Kenya, we see it. The work of the Greenbelt movement remains a shining example of how over 50 years, local communities have continued to engage in restoration because there are financial incentives flowing to them directly as groups, but as very small groups, and in ways that that funding would just not we couldn't invest in large numbers. So I think the real question we need to ask is, how are we going to crack that gap? We've got to figure out how to make finance work for that sustainable model of restoration, because it is sustainable. And after all, if we don't involve local communities, none of this is sustainable, because it is within, the restoration is happening in those communities with those individuals who must see the benefits flow to them from that restoration. And sometimes the ecosystem services are slow in coming, but there needs to be utter community engagement upfront in that restoration agenda.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Wanjira. Well, with that, we'd like to call the official program to a close. We want to thank you for your time and attention. We want to thank you for putting your questions in the chat. For the questions that we weren't able to get to during the live session, we will follow up with everyone with responses to those questions and also with the presentation materials. I'd like to thank so much our speakers and our panelists. I'd like to congratulate the team as well as the people of Sidhi who were heavily involved in that process in guiding the information that has resulted in this report. I think we all know that this is the beginning of a journey. This report can help to generate that shared understanding of what's possible, but there's still much to be done in bringing ourselves together. And if I was going to say, like, what is the one core theme that we've heard throughout the presentations, it's this idea of coming together, right? Whether that's to create more blended finance mechanisms, whether that's to have more aggregation of our projects and our systems, whether that's connecting as people to share good practices and lessons of what has worked, whether that's coming together for convergent action to make sure that our financing mechanisms are well coordinated in landscapes. As we head into 2021, we take this as our charter to find ways to work better together and to pull together these various work streams so that we can see these benefits flow into these critical communities and ecosystems. With that, I'd like to thank you all so much for your attention and your time. And we look forward to following up with each of you by email. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.